Welcome to the Deep Dive
Today we're going to unpack
on Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, the Sahel states.
and this idea that's floating around, right? That maybe, just maybe, they're kicking off a new phase of Pan-African unity.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is really just to get into the arguments and the insights from this specific source. What's it actually saying?
What are its main points about Traoré? About neocolonialism, economic freedom? How does the speaker see Africa's future unfolding?
Well, according to this transcript, Traoré isn't just, another leader. The speaker sees him as representing something really significant.
Like he's reigniting a vision.
Yeah, a vision for a united, prosperous Africa. Something the speaker felt might have been fading a bit.
Okay, so to really understand where the source is coming from, we probably need to nail down a couple of their key terms first. They talk a lot about neocolonialism.
Right. What does this source mean by that exactly?
Well, the way they define it in the transcript, it's tied really closely to neoliberalism. It's mainly about financial ownership.
Financial ownership. So foreign powers, corporations owning a country's assets.
Pretty much. It's not necessarily, boots on the ground like the old colonial days. The source frames it as more subtle, but just as powerful, maybe more so. Foreign entities owning resources, funding the military, even aid.
Which can create dependence, right? The source mentions that.
Yeah, serious dependence. Sometimes, they claim, it even wipes out local industries like agriculture. They call it political capture, basically turning a state into a vassal.
Okay, so that's neocolonialism, according to this source. And the flip side, the action they focus on, is nationalization.
How's that defined here?
Well, as the source explains it, nationalization is when the government steps in, takes control, or reclaims the nation's resources, on behalf of the people.
The core idea being to stop foreign companies owning those key assets.
Yeah. And the source makes an interesting point comparing, the private sector's motive profit versus a government's motive, which is supposedly national interest.
They used that infrastructure example, didn't they? Like bullet trains.
Exactly. The argument is a private company might not build something huge like that if it doesn't see immediate profit, especially if it's got a monopoly anyway.
But a government, thinking about the whole country's development, might push ahead even if the payoff takes years.
Right. Which kind of sets the stage for how this source talks about Ibrahim Traoré and what's happening in the Sahel.
Okay, let's get into that. Traoré.
The source presents him as this young military captain in Burkina Faso. And the central argument they're making is that his rise, specifically, has reignited that Pan-African fire.
Bringing back memories of Thomas Sankara, that kind of spirit.
Exactly. And the source really highlights the role of social media, independent media.
In spreading this narrative super fast, kind of rekindling that spark today as they see it.
And a big sign for this speaker that this isn't just talk is the formation of the AES.
The Association of Sahel States, yeah, they see that unity as really key.
But the main focus, the action that gets the most attention in the source, is the nationalization of mineral wealth.
Gold, uranium, rare earths.
Right. This is framed as the move that cuts the neocolonialism string. It hits the system right at its economic heart, as they put it.
And the source makes a point of contrasting this with, well, what they claim happened with earlier revolutionary governments in Africa.
What's the contrast?
Their argument is that other movements, after their revolutions, often had to run straight to the IMF, the World Bank, for loans.
And the source claims that just pull them back into that same system, political capture again.
That's the claim. So what they find significant about Traoré and the AES is this reported decision to, tell the Europeans to leave.
And not immediately go cap in hand to the World Bank or IMF.
Right. That's seen as a major break. And the unity with Niger and Mali, that's presented as giving them the strength to actually do that.
They even mention the AES setting up its own development bank.
Yeah, a way to kind of keep the values circulating between themselves, provide their own financing, internal loans.
Interesting. And the source also points fingers, well, not fingers, but points towards Ghana.
Yeah, suggesting Ghana is kind of leaning in that direction. They specifically mention Ghana nationalizing its gold.
And finding a big new reserve. The source thinks that might push them further down that path.
It's all presented as part of this potential shift.
Okay, so if nationalization cuts the old ties, what's the new economic plan, according to the source?
Yeah.
How do they replace that previous system?
Well, the shift described is basically selling their resources directly onto the world market. build up their own capital that way.
And this connects to the global economy right now, doesn't it? The source talks about gold prices.
It does. Yeah, they mentioned gold being around, what, $3,500 an ounce? And then they make this pretty bold prediction, maybe up to $10,000 an ounce.
Wow. Why such a jump?
Well, the source links it to global instability, but also importantly to the devaluation of fiat currencies, paper money. And then they connect that back to Africa's history. These golden ages, they talk about Ethiopia, Songhai, ancient Ghana, Mali, Kemet, Mansa Musa.
Where gold was central.
Absolutely central. The source is basically saying, look, gold has always been tied to African wealth and power.
So what was happening before this nationalization push, in their view? Where was the wealth going?
The source claims it was being siphoned off quietly, mostly to Western countries they named Canada and France specifically.
And that this was actually financing the Western world. Under the quiet is the phrase they use.
Yeah, and they argue that nationalization, the act of taking control, allowed them to actually look at the books.
And uncover this alleged siphoning.
Exactly. Leading to court cases, the source claims, that aren't getting much press internationally.
Okay, so they're getting this capital now by selling resources directly. What does the source say Traoré is actually doing with the money? What are the priorities?
Well, the source makes a big deal about this. They emphasize the stated priorities are investing heavily in mechanizing agriculture.
Tractors, race processing machines, things like that.
Yeah, practical stuff and infrastructure, specifically importing road building machines.
And they contrast this with luxury spending.
Right. The speaker explicitly says, he's not buying Bugattis, not partying in Dubai. The focus is supposedly on development.
And that road plan had a specific number attached in the source, didn't it?
It did, a really ambitious one, building 5,000 kilometers of road per year.
Per year? Wow. How does that compare?
Well, the source contrasts it directly with the French colonial era, claiming the French built only 3,500 kilometers in total.
So that comparison is obviously meant to highlight the scale of the new ambition.
Definitely. And this leads into a wider historical context the source brings up. They talk about a black print, or like a blueprint.
A blueprint attributed to whom?
To Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia. The source draws these really interesting parallels.
Between Traoré now and Selassie back then, like what?
Things like asserting economic power internationally, pushing for mechanized agriculture, setting up agricultural colleges.
Training local scientists.
Exactly. And even importing the printing press, which the source sees as key for controlling the narrative, the media.
Did the source mention other things attributed to Selassie?
Yeah, they also brought up Selassie supposedly granting or revising Ethiopia's constitution, giving people voting rights.
Framing it as turning peasants into citizens.
That's the language they used, yeah. It's all part of building this historical parallel.
The source also mentions the criticism Traoré gets, right? Being called a dictator.
It does.
Yeah.
And it immediately compares that to what they call propaganda against Selassie.
How does the source counter that criticism?
Well, the speaker puts forward this argument that, quote, most places don't develop under democracy, and they argue democracies can be easily manipulated from outside through funding.
Suggesting you need to follow the money when you hear those kinds of labels.
That's the implication. Again, it's important we stress this is the viewpoint from this specific source material. We're just unpacking their perspective.
Understood. So, given this path Traoré is taking, according to the source, what kind of challenges does it mention him facing?
Oh, it's explicit about challenges. Great opposition, it says. Even attempts on Traoré's life. It paints a picture of a dangerous path.
And what about allies? Where does the source see strategic partnerships forming?
It points directly to alliances with the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa.
Framing it not just as finding new friends, but as tapping into a major alternative power bloc.
Exactly, situating it all within this larger global great power struggle.
And in that struggle, what are Africa's advantages, according to this source?
Two main things. A rising consciousness among the people, and crucially, the continent's vast natural resources.
And there's this underlying belief in the source about where power really lies.
Yes, that ultimately power rests with the people. They claim Haile Selassie understood that too.
It connects back to that Pan-African idea. The source also brings up historical setbacks, right?
Yeah, it frames things like the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, or campaigns against figures like Kwame Nkrumah as events that delayed this kind of progress.
Suggesting the current movement is kind of picking up where they left off, overcoming those past obstacles.
That seems to be the implication. It all builds towards the speaker's main point, their central thesis.
Would you?
Pretty straightforwardly stated that Africa is now entering a golden age. An age of Africa, an age of Pan-Africanism.
And Traoré isn't the cause, but a sign.
A symptom is the word they use. A symptom of this era that, in their view, was bound to happen because that Pan-African spirit just couldn't be kept down forever.
Okay, so let's quickly recap this deep dive into the source material. We've looked at his perspective on Ibrahim Traoré as this figure challenging neocolonialism, mainly using resource nationalization.
We covered the economic priorities, the source highlights agriculture, infrastructure, and the historical parallels it draws, especially with Haile Selassie.
And it all leads to this core idea from the source.
Yeah.
That Africa is moving into a new golden age.
Right. So maybe a final thought to leave you, the listener, with drawing from this material. Considering all the opposition, the history of delays, the global power struggles mentioned.
How might this path towards the golden age, the source envisions, actually play out? And what hurdles, maybe ones not even fully clear yet, still stand in the way according to the dynamics presented in the source?